Okay, sorry about that, folks. Yeah, trying a different microphone system anyway today. Yeah, so we all probably want to be fit at some point. So you can kind of get into this. We're going to talk a little bit about this in this unit and the next unit, a little bit about health and disease and those kind of things. There's a lot of benefit to being fit. And we probably know some of them. You mentioned energy. Sometimes it means you're strong enough to do something. I hurt my arm a couple of years ago and ended up with tendinitis. And it's my right arm, and didn't get physiotherapy soon enough. So it took me a long time to kind of get it better. And in the meantime, because I was doing everything with my left arm, believe it or not, I hurt my left arm. And I realized after about 6 months of kind of just like getting everyone else to carry in the groceries and things like that, that my arm suddenly had become a lot weaker. It was amazing just without use, right? And how awful that was. I can't remember what it was I was trying to lift, and I was like, wow, this is a lot heavier than I remember it being. And it was because I had literally spent 6 months of kind of wimping out on lifting anything because it hurt my arm a lot to lift something. So it takes a while to get back into those things, but obviously having the ability to do things. And if you take a look in the textbook, I think there's like 2 pages that talk about all the benefits of exercise. So things like it gives you stronger bones. And that actually becomes really important as you age, particularly for women. We're talking about osteoporosis. You want to have strong bones. But generally, anybody over 40 is downhill in a lot of ways. You start to lose muscle mass, you start to lose bone mass naturally as you hit about 40. And after menopause for women, those things accelerate a little bit. And as you get older, those things accelerate a little bit. So exercise and strength training is important for those reasons. I say there's notes about the immune system. We'll talk a little bit about that next unit. But having fitness does enhance the immune system in a lot of ways. We're talking about heart health. We're going to talk about heart health in the next unit as well. Type 2 diabetes. So a bunch of things that we've talked about already. And then there's all the other things, right? You can see mental health and sleep, and sometimes it means you feel a little bit better about yourself as well, right? And then those kind of things. But like I said, take a look. It's worth it kind of a read through that list in the textbook because there's some things you may not be aware of. It's a huge list. I don't really want to get into all those things a bunch. So some stats for you, right? So if you take a look at this one here, it's showing, what do we have here? The blue is both, red is boys and green is girls, and it's talking about what percent are getting kind of the recommended amount of physical activity, and it's not 100%. Boys seem to be doing a little bit better of a job than girls. So this is something we think about in the health area, right? And you can see there's all sorts of promotions for getting kids to get activity and those kind of things. And in some ways, they're probably better off when you start to look at adults. Particularly as we age, the physical activity levels seem to go down and down and down. And that might be when it becomes more important. And we're not necessarily talking about rigorous activity here. We're talking about anything that would be in the moderate category. So I'm using that word moderate. It's almost impossible to figure out what that means. And I think the problem is when you're looking at the experts and the recommendations, people have different definitions of what moderate means. Sometimes they mean it has something to do with you're getting your heart rate up to a certain level. Sometimes they say anything above resting is moderate. And so, probably better to be a little bit more on the brisk end than on the slow end if you're going for a walk kind of thing, if you're using a walk to get exercise. But exactly what is meant by moderate. But if you think about it, like I said, a lot of people are relatively sedentary. And these last couple of years, it's been very easy to be so, unfortunately, which is something that I've definitely been trying to do better on. These are the recommendations by, what is this, Canadian Society for Exercise Physiology. I'm not really familiar with them, but they seem to be cited pretty much everywhere where it's talking about physical activity. And the amount that's actually recommended for children it seems crazy. Like as an adult, who has this kind of time, right? 60 minutes a day, right? And I know a lot of you are this active, and that's great. But you know, life happens when you're an adult, and suddenly you have a job and kids and all sorts of other things. And 60 minutes a day is actually, you know, starts to turn into quite a bit sometimes. It is doable, but for kids, that's what's recommended. And so, you know, in theory, most of them are getting it during recess and things like that. But again, it depends on what they're doing. You know, and of course, I've seen a lot of articles talk about how it's been decreasing over the last 20 years. And of course, they're usually blaming smartphones and things like that. But whether that's the case or not, I wouldn't be surprised. But I'm sure that's just one item of a whole bunch of things that is showing that decline in activity, right? You know, people always complain about their children, and they always worry about this generation because, you know, they're not getting out enough and those kind of things. And I think that's just a generational trend, is you always have to worry about your children because they're not getting the same experience that you are. But in some ways it's true, right? In terms of like what parents allow kids to do now compared to, you know, my generation, for example, right? You know, my mom, I remember being like 7 years old, and my mom putting me out the door and her just saying, okay, make sure you're back for lunch, right? She had no idea where I was, all over the neighborhood, right? Now you do that kind of thing, and you know, child services comes knocking on your door and those kind of things. And anyway, I know there's healthy debates around that. I'll get to you in 1 second here. I know that I'm trying to remember where it was, somewhere in the States, but there was a parent who was doing that exact thing. There was actually a playground right across the street, right? So she could literally see her daughter from the kitchen window, a 10-year-old, and people were calling, you know, the authorities on them, and they actually put through a law called, I can't remember what it's called, free range parenting or something like that, to allow parents to do that within reason, kind of thing, right? But anyway, those are some of the debates and concerns and those kind of things that are going on around all of this, right? One more example, and then I'll get to you, is another thing I think about a little bit is just in terms of, you know, when I went to see a friend, pretty much almost all of my friends were in walking or biking distance when I was a kid, right? Nowadays, it's very common to drive your kid across town to visit a friend, right? For various reasons, whether it's a friend through sports or schools or things like that. And so you're seeing these kind of trends change, whether they're better or worse, I don't know, but it does affect the physical levels of children. Question, comment?
Just a comment on that. My mom works in kindergarten, and she said that like half the class can't even like run a lap in gym class. And maybe that's because they're just being like shoved with technology, like on their iPads, too much screen time. I don't know.
I always wonder that too, right? I remember moving to Fort McMurray, and right across the street was a family with children almost exact same age. And I remember the youngest, so maybe 3 years old or whatever, right? I don't know if I ever saw that child run. And I remember just being concerned about these kids. I was just saying, like, they don't seem to do anything, right? Whereas my kids are were very active. You can't stop them from bouncing off the walls. And anyway, yeah, it's just interesting to make those observations for sure. Yeah. Question, comment?
I think part of it is because there's no other kids outside, it's hard to send your kid out because there's not that group safety. Because I've lived in areas where all the kids are out and you can still send the kids out to play.
Yeah.
But like where I live, I've never seen a kid outside playing.
Well, for sure, yeah. Your street can make a big difference too, right? I mean, I've lived in townhouses, and sometimes in those areas there's tons of kids, right? And they're right there.
Yeah.
and it's inviting and you know, those kind of things, right?
15 other parents who will step out if somebody
I don't see most of my neighbors in the wintertime, and some of them have kids, like they're gone, right? Like, I don't know what they do. No idea. In summer, they all suddenly, I'm seeing kids that I'm like, does that kid live in our neighborhood? You know, kind of thing.
I think that's the case because when we bought our house, one of the first things that one of the neighbors did, the little girl and her mom came over and knocked on the door and were like looking for kids at our house, and we're like, no,
oh, that's cute.
No, we don't have any. So I think that's definitely true. And I noticed like once the 3 kids in our cul-de-sac, that one family, their kids will go outside, and then it's like everyone else will see them, and then their kids start going outside. It's almost like one family has to kick their kids outside.
Yeah, and this is like, it's interesting to see how cultural things affect so many other aspects of our lives, right? In terms of, you know, what your friends are doing, or as a parent, what the other parents are doing with their kids, and all those kind of things. As a culture, we morph and change and whatnot, right? For sure. We've already talked about adults a little bit already, particularly the Simon 250 minutes a week is what's recommended. So 21.4 minutes a day, I think, is what it was. And you can see up there, it's talking about brisk walking and as being a recommendation. Let me just go back to kids. I just want to say one other thing about kids. Notice it says nothing about weight training. The general recommendations with kids is that they do not do any weight training until they're about 16. Just because, of course, they, were concerned about bones and things like that. So any kind of activity that would contribute towards strength training and whatnot is things that they would be doing naturally with their body. So you can see some examples there, skipping and things like that. And, if there's every once in a while you hear about a kid that's like 10 years old and really into wanting to build strength. And so always the recommendation by the experts is that they do things that don't involve weights, right? So push-ups and things like that, right? And you can see some younger kids, but usually they don't have the capacity to really develop a lot of excess muscle until after puberty anyway. So it's not something that is recommended by every expert that I've ever seen. But you can see that with adults, it's talking about actual weight training. And that does not necessarily mean using weights. Strength training can use a variety of other things. There's all sorts of tools, and like I mentioned, push-ups. There's I can't think of what they're called, the exercise bands. There's many variety of things that you can be doing that can contribute to strength training. Sometimes the exercise that you're actually doing, you can be doing aerobic exercise that can actually contribute to strength as well. Swimming is an interesting example of something like that, where you can build strength by swimming or not. You can go relatively easy, or you can go relatively hard, but you do have resistance through water, right? And the same thing, I have an elliptical at home that is stuck on level 20. So whenever I use it now, it is definitely some strength training going on at the same time. Those kind of things, right? So just a mention about that. You can see the recommendation for people that are over 65, it's still about 150 minutes. And usually the actual intensity of the recommendations is a little bit different. And depending obviously on a person's capabilities and things like that, people need to be careful sometimes with, bones and whatnot, not doing extreme weightlifting, for example, when you're 65 plus and those kind of things. Okay, let's talk a little bit about fitness and getting fit and those kind of things. So generally when people talk about fitness, there's 4 categories, right? So flexibility, strength, endurance, and cardiorespiratory kind of fitness, right? And all of those things can be improved with training, and your ideal kind of fitness program includes a little bit of all of those things. And I think we all know people that are focused on one or the other, or one or two of those things, right? I know tons of people that are crazy into yoga, for example. Yoga is good for improving flexibility. Flexibility, usually you're talking about stretching. And stretching, by the way, that's another one too. A lot of people, and it's slowly changing. It's kind of something that's interesting. I remember going through school and all those kind of things, and every coach would get you to sit down and do these static stretches forever. And I hate them, they suck. I'm just being honest. And all the research is showing that doing that before exercises, for the most part, is probably not necessarily the best idea. Dynamic stretching is kind of the new trend, which means you're doing stretching that is involved movement, right? So doing things like bum kicks, or there's a variety of things where you're rotating your hip muscles, those kind of things that are better. And so in many cases, when people are doing actual exercise, they are getting some stretching going on as well. And there's different camps on how flexible you should be. And there's some research to show that a little extra flexibility can actually add to both strength and endurance. And so, you see some of those different philosophies from different sports experts and coaches and things like that. We'll get into muscle strength and endurance here in a minute, but I just want to kind of talk about flexibility. The textbook kind of really ignores it for the most part. So one thing to say about it is to become fit, you have to, it involves training, right? And that means that you're training, you could be training for something specifically. it's obvious to think about, for example, if you are a, let's say, long distance runner, then your training is probably going to involve running, right? If you're training for swimming, you're probably going to involve some swimming, and so on and so on. Hockey, soccer, or whatever, baseball, you know, you're training the muscles that you need. If you're a tennis player, you're probably training that one arm a lot more than the other arm, kind of thing, right? And then generally training might involve kind of complementary exercises, right? So if you are a, you know, let's say you're a track athlete, you're not just running all the time. Sometimes you're doing weights, maybe particularly you're focusing on your legs because you want a little extra strength in that part of your body, and so on. But anyway, a lot of us are just training because we want to look good or be fit, or, you know, have all the benefits from physical exercise. But one thing to say about this is that if you don't use it, you lose it, right? And that's true for so many things in life, right? You know, how many people took calculus in high school? Anyone? Anyone? Yeah, so that's a good example, right? A lot of people do that calculus course in high school, or they might do one at university, and then ask them to do calculus 5 years from then, gone, right? I can tell you that happened to me. I did calculus in high school, did it in university, and it wasn't a big deal. The university calculus was hard; it was easier than the high school calculus, believe it or not. And then in my third year, I took this chemistry class, and suddenly the guy's doing calculus, and it was gone, like 100%. I was like, I recognized the word calculus, like that's how bad it was. So it was a bit of a rough class. But you know, it's true with your muscles, your flexibility, all those kind of things. You know, one more example, I'll tell you, I used to swim laps. I used to be a competitive swimmer, and you know, I love going to the lake in the summer. And one thing that I like to do every summer when I go to Ontario, my in-laws have a cabin. There's an island to swim out to, and I can tell you there's muscles that I used to have that are no longer there. I just don't do the swimming anymore, and I can feel it, right? And it's a very different experience swimming for me now than it used to be. I still have all the muscle memory, but the ability to do things I used to be able to do is basically gone, because it's not something that I really do anymore, unfortunately. All right, so how do we do this, right? You train, and you need to kind of push things a little bit, right? So our bodies are good at adapting in many, many ways, right? You exercise, push yourself a little bit, your body recognizes the signal that it needs to improve, you know, where you've been using that part of your body, and then it does so accordingly. And I'll talk about that in a minute in terms of what's going on with the physiology. But generally, there's a scientific term for this. You can see it on the board there. It's hypertrophy, right? And that means that muscles are gaining mass, basically. And it might mean that they're gaining mass to be able to do more weight, or it might mean it has something to do with they can endure more, right? So those are two kind of things, right? Strength versus endurance that are happening with your muscles. The opposite effect is atrophy, right? So you may hear about that, right? And that's when your muscles or bones or whatever is shrinking, and that's because they're not necessarily being used. You can see there's some notes there about rest and whatnot, and generally what you're doing, right, when you exercise is you're using those body parts, and believe it or not, there's a little bit of wear and tear that actually goes on at a cellular level, right? So you know, you're lifting something with your muscles, and you know, those muscle cells are contracting and relaxing, and some of them will actually have little tiny micro fractures in them, and your body goes and repairs it, and it likes to do a good job, is what it does. So it doesn't just repair it exactly how it was, but it actually makes it a little bit better, as a little extra tissue. And that's kind of what's happening with your hypertrophy. And that actually happens with bones as well. They talk about kids who break their bones, and you can actually look at scan, you can see that there's extra kind of thick calcium on the fracture where the bone was broken, and it's your body trying to kind of do an extra good job so that it you know, it's a little stronger for in case that ever happens again. Same thing happens with your muscles. And there's other adaptations that happen as well. Your muscles will start absorbing and producing more myoglobin. So we talked about myoglobin. I don't know when that was. Myoglobin is like hemoglobin. It binds oxygen. Hemoglobin does it in your blood. Myoglobin does it in your muscles. So it stores oxygen in your muscles. right? So we need oxygen to burn fuel and do things. And so if you have lots of myoglobin in your muscles are going to have more oxygen, and you're going to be able to do more things. And there's actually illegal drugs you can get that can increase your myoglobin in your muscles. And so these are things are taken by, I wonder if that was one of the things that Lance Armstrong was guilty of. I can't remember the name of the drug, but anyway, yeah. So the idea is to get more oxygen into your muscles so that you can have that more endurance and beat all the competition. And you can do that with training, right? And another way to do that with training, by the way, is to train at high altitudes, right? High altitudes, there's actually less oxygen in the atmosphere. And so your body will adapt and realize it needs more oxygen, and the way to do so is to put more hemoglobin in your blood and more myoglobin in your muscle tissue. So kind of interesting things. You can talk about the vascular system, and there's lots of changes that happen to try to adapt and get you used to doing these kind of things. And that's what we're doing with training. There's some more notes there, right? Store extra glycogen, build up extra connective tissues. So if you are vitamin C deficient, this is a bad thing for people training, right? Vitamin C, if you remember, will make, it's part of making collagen. Collagen is a big part of connective tissue. And vitamin C is actually good for absorbing iron as well. So it's kind of like a good thing to have there in the mix, right? In terms of what is going on. Iron, by the way, is used in blood. It's used in myoglobin. And so athletes, the recommendation is to have a little bit of extra iron in your diet as well. We'll talk about iron a little bit later as well. Was there anything else I was going to point out there? So a whole bunch of list of things. Myoglobin I mentioned, extra enzymes. Sometimes enzymes, depending on your type of training, you'll actually produce extra enzymes to use fat as energy or to break down glycogen, kind of depending on what you're doing, right, in terms of the intensity and duration of your training and those kind of things. And there's a lot of nuances there that are kind of interesting to get into. What else? Fitness, I mentioned flexibility. We're going to talk about weight training in a minute, and we're going to talk about aerobic activity in a minute as well. And like I said, you know, depending on the activity, you can kind of do a lot of these things all in one exercise, right? And that's why certain exercises such as swimming and cross-country skiing are kind of highlighted as things that kind of give your whole body a variety of things that are going on there. And generally those two sports are a little bit more lower impact than something like running, where you're constantly pounding your feet, sometimes on pavement, can be a little harder in the joints and those kind of things. Here's a sample fitness plan, right? Kind of, you know, just from the textbook, talking about, you know, some of the variety of things that you can do. And I think one of the slides was mentioning it's good to have a variety of things for your muscles to do. And the reason why that is so that you can do a little bit of something one day, give your muscles a chance to recover another day. And there's all sorts of programs out there, you know, people that are looking to gain muscle mass, right? They'll talk about getting rest. So maybe the one day you're working on these muscle groups and day two you're working on a different muscle group. So you give muscle group A a chance to kind of recover and build and et cetera, et cetera. But you can see these kind of plans here. You know, you give your variety of different things such as aerobic and weight training and those kind of things. And you know, anyway, like I said, I'm not going to get into all these different fitness plans. I have more opinions than anything about them. But there's a lot of good ones out there. And the best ones combine a little bit of everything, a little bit of strength training, a little bit of cardiovascular, and depending on your goals, the balance and the intensity and the duration may be different for everybody. So let's talk a little bit about weight training. Like I said, weight training doesn't necessarily have to involve weights. There are a variety of other things that can be used, or your body, you know, push-ups and those kind of things. But it's very important, and this is something that on the assignment, people were giving me relatively brief answers. If you just spend a little bit of time, just even on the internet, you can see there's actually quite a number of different kind of things you can talk about the benefits of weight training, right? And one of them you can see on there, which is a big one for some adults, is reducing the risk of back injury. Weight training can have benefits for mental health. A big one that only some people picked up on was strengthening the bones, which is like something that I mentioned is important as you get older. And again, you know, I think about that age 40 because I happen to be older than 40, right? Losing muscle mass kind of naturally. And at some point, you know, I don't know what it is. I think there's something like 2% a year if you don't do any strength training. And so that means the clock is ticking, right? And I'm going to just die eventually because no muscle mass left, right? Anyway, just something that I think about a little bit. You see there's other notes up here about enhancing performance for sports, right? That's something some people are thinking about as well, right? And chronic injury and those kind of things. Another thing I think we talked about a little bit in the last unit is that people trying to be fit, muscle mass tends to burn a lot more calories than something such as adipose tissue. And so that's another benefit of having extra muscle mass in there. So depending on your goal, you might have different kind of training. And again, when you're talking about the elite stuff, I'm not going to get into that. I have more opinions than I know what's based on by science. But generally, if you're looking to build strength, you're looking to push yourself with high resistance and low repetitions, right? So generally, again, there's different formulas on this. Some people say, you know, 6 repetitions, right? So that means something you can lift barely for 6 times in a row. Some people say 10 to 15. But that's a lot lower than if you were going for endurance. If you're going for endurance, you're going to go with a lesser weight and, you know, maybe 20 reps or something like that. Like I said, lots of different programs and different opinions on exactly how you do that. I remember I was looking at one program and the guy was saying, you know, this is the way you must do it. You must do 10 reps. And then when you can do 12, you have to make the weight higher, you know, and some people have these exact formulas and maybe because it's worked for them. May not necessarily work for you. Everybody's a little bit different, right? And again, depending on what the goals are. But that's the general formula for weight training, right? Endurance versus strength are usually the 2 kind of things. And some people are going for somewhere in the middle, right? They would like to build a little muscle mass, maybe not too much, just become a little bit better defined and just be stronger overall. Like I said, there's lots of schemes like this. If you Google it, you'll see about 1,000 guys on YouTube and other places that are going to tell you exactly how to get buff, just like this guy. Mostly guys, I've noticed, and a lot of them are personal trainers trying to sell you a package as well, and some of them are not. There's a guy in, I'm just trying to remember where it was, somewhere in Ontario. He's on YouTube. He's got like 1 million followers, and he's a science guy as well, which is how I found him. And he's got all these plans and programs. I think he's selling stuff too, but a lot of, I mean, all his YouTube videos are free, and it's actually really good, some really good views. But you know, like I said, lots of different opinions on how these kind of things, and you know, I mean, I'm not going to give you all sorts of expert advice on these kind of things because obviously I'm not, you know, huge and buff, but you know, I'm hopefully where I want to be. But anyway, what else was going to say about this? Yeah, like I said, lots of different goals, right? Sometimes you're doing it for sport. Sometimes you're doing it just to feel better about yourself. You know, some people are going to the gym just to wear cool track clothes and chat with their friends. You know, I mean, there's lots of goals, right, that are different. And that's going to have a big difference on exactly what you're doing, right? You know, other things to keep in mind. You can see the last 3 on the list, injury history, medical conditions, things like that, you know, and if you're ever unsure, you know, consult with an expert, right? A personal trainer or something like that can help you out. So some general tips, and something I think we talked about a little bit before, is that a good balanced diet is going to help you to build muscle. And again, there's opinions on what is going to work best in terms of you know, people talk, there's all sorts of pre-workout and post-workout things like that. But generally, what do you need? Carbohydrates and protein, right? You need carbohydrates because you want the energy to be able to actually train. And you want the protein because you want to actually build muscle mass. So it's important that both of those are in there. Good fats in the diet's fine. The research is unclear on whether it's going to help you build your muscle. Fats are there for energy, just like everything else. But it's the carbohydrates and protein that are going to be important. People that are trying to build muscle mass may need to increase their protein content a little bit. Most people get more than enough protein, but a little extra may not be a bad thing, particularly around the actual training time. And talk about that a little bit as well in a few minutes. How much you need kind of depends on who you ask. Kind of maybe one of the best scales I heard is about a gram of protein for every inch of your height, or so every centimeter of your height is kind of a good one. And that gives you more than enough. Believe me, more than enough. It might be twice that you need for women that aren't trying to build muscle mass. To give you an idea, I'm about 179, 180 centimeters, so 180 grams of protein, you know, that kind of thing. And like I said, lots of different schemes on exactly how much you need, but usually a little bit more than usual. And gradual increasing loads or reps is essential, right? If you're just going to be doing 6 reps at the same weight forever, then you'll be good at doing that forever and nothing else, right? It's not going to build up that muscle mass. But those are the general tips, right? Everything else, like I said, is more nuanced, and there, you know, you get into that range of opinion and areas that might work for one person, less for another person, and those kind of things. And like I said, you know, I think last time, goals are important, right? For some people, their goal is to someday do 1 chin-up, right? You know, and that's okay, right? It depends on where you are, right? With chin-ups. Chin-ups is an interesting one. I'm using that as an example because that's something that at one point in my life I was very good at. I was a swimmer, I had strong arms, a light body, I could do 30 chin-ups, which is just unbelievable apparently. Right? Now I can do, you know, about 6, which is more than a year ago where I could do 0. And then that was my goal, to be able to, I'm trying to work up to doing 10 again. I told you I hurt my arms. There's a point where I couldn't do any, and I was just like, okay, this is bad. I'm weak. I need to do something about this. But some people, that's not even a possibility. So if that's you, don't worry if you can't do a single chin-up. Chin-ups are very hard. Work on something a little easier. Even push-ups are hard for a lot of people, right? In terms of where your muscles are. So, you know, you start off small and work your way up. I have a friend. She is, I'm not sure how old, thinking around 55, right? She's the last 10 years been working on, like, one of those people that you did not peg for somebody that could do this kind of thing, right? And she started doing weight training about 10 years ago, and she can now deadlift 190 pounds, right? And I'm just like, I'm just amazed. I'm like, wow, that is just amazing. But it took her 10 years to get there. So, right, realistic goals are obviously very important. What about creatine? That is the one that just like every guy out there is taking, it seems, right? It's in all the protein shakes and everything. I used to know a lot about it. I remember reading up on it years ago, and when I read up on it, it was entirely 100% inconclusive, right? I was looking it up the other day, and this is basically what I found, right? About 70% of studies say that it might be helping. So, you know, there's some encouragement there. My concern is that it's not going to survive the digestive tract and get into your actual muscles. And we'll talk about what actually that compound actually does. So that's my thought on it. There's also placebo effects and things like that, but it might help, right? There's like 100 studies on it now, at least. And so apparently 70% of them say it's probably helping or might be helping or something in that category. But anyway, that's one of the big ones. If you're going to take one supplement, maybe, right? If you really want to know what's going to help with weight training, is doing the weights, right? Diet is great, and having protein in your diet and creatine and things like that. But doing that resistance training and working up, you know, from the 6 reps to 8 reps or whatever it is, that's the biggest part, is the actual training regime. It's probably more important than any one other thing. As much as we all want a nice quick fix, that would be great. Cardiorespiratory training benefits the heart. That's the big one. And there's tons of physiological things that are going on, tons and tons and tons. If you think about what's going on with your vascular system, you have veins, you have hemoglobin, you have a heart. The heart has muscles. With extreme training, you can actually grow your heart and make it bigger. I was reading about, so again, going back to swimming, when I was in high school, I remember hearing all about Victor Davis, who was a Canadian Olympic athlete who had at least one gold medal, and I even had a poster of him. And anyway, he died in a car accident, right? When he was like in his 20s. And I was reading an article about the person who got his heart. And this is like, I don't even know what year that was, possibly in the 1990s. They're still living and thriving today, right? So they were lucky they got a heart from an Olympic athlete. Imagine that, the luck there, right? Not for the athlete, but for the recipient, obviously. But yeah, so you're talking about all sorts of things going on physiologically. Like I said, strengthening heart muscles, increasing the capacity of your arteries and those kind of things. And it can actually remove plaque. And we'll talk about atherosclerosis in the next unit. We'll talk a little bit more about health and disease and those kind of things. And you can see it's talking about reducing blood pressure, and that's good as well for cardiovascular disease risk. Okay, so I want to move on and talk a little bit about energy and those kind of things, and talk about energy systems. This is something the textbook was really disappointing in how it kind of approached this whole thing. So there's a little bit more information here than is in the textbook. So I'm just warning you on that. If you're reading about it in the textbook, you may have to go a little deeper on this. Talks about the body having 3 energy systems, and it was really inadequate in how it really explains them in my mind. So here's the 3, right? Phosphogenic system, the lactic acid system, we'll call it the anaerobic system, and the aerobic system. Okay, the textbook is calling them the muscle's energy reserve, the anaerobic fuel system, and the aerobic fuel system. So not too bad, but like I said, I kind of didn't like it in terms of how they went into all the details there. So all 3 of these systems, by the way, are usually kind of active all the time, but kind of depends on what you're doing, which one is sort of the predominant activity, or sorry, energy system, okay? And by the way, don't get energy systems mixed up with the 3 energy sources, right? Carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, okay? And we'll kind of get into that as well. But let's take a look at these things, right? So that's what the textbook is calling it, the muscle's energy reserves. So what is that? So if you took high school biology, you may know that ATP is the energy molecule of the cell, okay? So ATP is a molecule, and it's a little bit like currency. If you think about, you have a $20 bill in your pocket, and then it gets spent and it's gone. So ATP is that molecule. Energy is put into ATP, then it's used by a bazillion cellular processes, and one of them, of course, is muscle contraction, and that's what the muscles actually use. So when we burn our fuel, the glucose is kind of you can think of fat and glucose and proteins as sort of a long-term energy reserve. Gets burnt, the energy gets transferred into ATP, and the ATP is the actual thing at the muscle cell level that says, okay, flex, relax, okay? And that's what the ATP is doing. So you'll hear a lot about ATP if you kind of get into some of these things. So ATP is a very, very short-lived molecule. We're talking about your muscles right now have maybe 1 second worth, okay? So if I'm walking around this room and I have 1 second worth of energy, I would be dead on the floor very quickly. So we have sort of a tricky way to store a little extra energy in our muscles. That's using that creatine stuff. It's actually called creatine phosphate. And that can be converted to ATP like that. So our muscles have 3 to 10 seconds of that, right? So anything you're doing that lasts, let's say, less than 10 seconds, it's predominantly using that energy system. So any of those sports that are like lightning fast, so the 100-meter sprint, the world record is 9 point something seconds. So those guys are using, maybe 95% of those energy reserves that are in your muscles, the phosphagen system. And boom, it's that really fast energy. Same thing, right? If somebody in this room was kicking a soccer ball in my head and I had to just duck out of the way, there we go. It's the energy in my muscles, gone. That's it, right? Okay, so that's the quick system. That's really important for sprints and those kind of things. And if you're trying to do those 10 reps really quickly, then a big part of that energy reserve is going to come from that. And so the training is going to maybe help you to build up your creatine in that. And that's why people are taking it. They think it's going to give them extra energy in the weight room. And like I said, there's some debate around the research on that. So you don't hear that talked about a lot, except for in the weight training area and for people doing sprint type of sports. The other two systems you hear about a lot more are the anaerobic and the aerobic system. So anaerobic means, what is anaerobic? No oxygen, yeah. So this is kind of your short-term system here. Depending on what you're looking at in the literature, some people say maybe 3 minutes, some people say 2 minutes, some people say 1 minute. So I put 2 minutes on there. But like I said, all three of these systems, you can think of them as all three working all the time, but one of them is sort of going to be your predominant thing. So if you're doing something kind of short term, so let's say the 400-meter sprint, right? You know, that's going to be like, I don't know what the world record is, but I think it's less than a minute. If you're doing, you can see on the other example there, 100-meter swim. So that's maybe about a minute, depending on which sport you're doing and how fast you actually are. Maybe it's a little bit longer, those kind of things. So you're tapping into that, right? You know, and it doesn't mean you're holding your breath for a minute to do that run, that 400 meters or anything like that. You're definitely going to be breathing pretty hard. If you had to do a 400-meter sprint right now and you're going all out, you're going to be breathing really hard. That's because literally after, well, I mean, how long can you guys hold your breath? You know, I mean, most of us, it's probably less than a minute. Some people, it's like after 10 seconds, you're already feeling that desire to breathe, right? So remember that 10-second mark? I said the first energy system is 10 seconds, right? So it means that your anaerobic system can kick in right away, but immediately your body knows you can't sustain that forever. So it says, start breathing. We need to turn on the aerobic system eventually, or at least kind of start ramping it up, because the aerobic system is just slow and steady, slow and steady. And if you want to speed it up, you need to breathe a little bit more, and training is going to help as well, right? So this anaerobic system, it's not bad. You can sustain it and get a decent amount of energy relatively quickly by doing a process called glycolysis and nothing else. And you can get a little bit of ATP in those muscles, and you can sustain it for a bit. So another example I tell people is like, depending on how fit you are, you know, ask you how many push-ups you could do in a row, right? Now, depending on whether you do push-ups on a regular basis, that number is going to be a little bit different. But push-ups are a good example because they're kind of difficult. And so for, you know, kind of a lot of people, right, you know, 1 or 2 push-ups is going to be your phosphagen system, right? And then your 10 seconds is done, and you keep on going, and you're doing okay, right? And there's a certain point for some of you, I know it could be 5, some of you it could be 20, right? It's just going to get, you know, your arms, your muscles are going to get a little more wobbly, and they're going to feel fatigued. You may, and there may be a little bit of soreness in there. So what is that all about? And that is because you're not breaking down glucose completely. You're not doing it with oxygen. You're just breaking it down just a little bit. You're grabbing a little bit of ATP, and the byproduct is something called lactate or lactic acid. And so athletes who are trained, they are always talking about lactic acid buildup, particularly if you're training at a really high intensity for a while. Same thing with the weightlifting, right? If you're doing, you know, your 10 reps and you do them quickly, and then maybe you do something else, you come back and you can feel, you know, the second time around, maybe you can only do 8 reps, right? And you still feel in the muscles that soreness and all that. And that's the lactic acid buildup that's in there that athletes talk a lot about. It eventually gets metabolized by the liver, but it's something, again, training can help you develop tolerance against. So this is the system that kind of kicks in the short term. And the hope is you can, with training, you know, kind of get that aerobic system to go in. So the phosphagen system is just ATP stored in your muscles. Like I said, seconds. The anaerobic system, glucose, almost exclusively glucose. So what does that mean? It really means all the glycogen that's in your muscles right now. Okay, and so that's the idea if you're doing relatively shorter sports, right? Or not marathons and things like that. The idea is to train to build your muscles to have lots of glycogen in them. A small amount may come from protein. Remember, some amino acids can get converted to glucose. Okay, so a little bit kind of in that category, depending on your diet. But if you have lots of carbohydrates in your diet, then the amount of protein used for energy is going to be minimal because your body would rather have carbohydrates for fuel. So the aerobic system, depending on how much reserves you have, in theory, you could go for a long, long time. Glycogen, depending on your reserves, kind of 2 hours max. roughly. Again, depends on the individual. But it doesn't matter because the aerobic system, it just will take anything you got, fat, protein, kind of if you don't have the glucose, it'll start, taking down some amino acids and whatnot. But, in theory, you could go on for a long, long time. And some people do, right? Some people do marathons, right? I don't know how long marathon takes. I have no idea. It's 26 miles. I know that, or 24 miles or something. I just know that would take a long time. Anyone know how long a marathon takes?
Ranges, so it can be anywhere from like 5 to 10 hours.
Yeah, so there you go, right? So I know it's more than 2 hours, right? Yeah, I know as I was listening to this podcast about these ultra marathons that are like 100 and 200 miles, and there's one going through like the Sahara Desert, and I'm just like, these people are nuts. But anyway, they're going on for a while, and they're gonna use up their glycogen stores for sure. Most of us, for most sports or activities, that's not going to happen. Like I said, you're looking at around 2 hours-ish, right? But within that 2 hours, you are going to be using fat, for sure. Your body realizes that it's got to be using other fuels as well. And depending on, again, the training, the duration, the intensity, and those kind of things is all going to affect that, right? But in theory, you could go on for a while. I don't know what this says underneath there. So in terms of the amount of calories expended, you've got maybe a little less than 2,000 calories of glycogen, most people. And for the aerobic system, I think for many people, they can expend up to 70,000 calories. That includes your glycogen and your fat, and be capable of doing it. Again, training is going to help, obviously. So the aerobic system is using oxygen. And like I said, it's burning glucose, fat, and all those kind of things, and not just bringing them down to the lactic acid level, but you're doing what we call the complete combustion. It's all getting broken down into carbon dioxide and water, and of course, the thing we love the most is just the ATP. That's energy, right? So those are the three energy systems. I have another kind of thing here that's showing a little bit more detail in a graph showing how they take over at different times in terms of the duration of the exercise, and you can see lots of details there. They're showing the mitochondria and things like that. Don't too worry about the details. And what I really liked is the graph at the bottom that showed how the different systems kind of kick in, but no one system is ever completely turned off. They're all kind of usually running to some degree, even if one of them is just going to be 95 or 99% at the time or whatever. And those are the three body systems. So it's important to know a little bit about these body systems to think about eating for exercise and eating for athletics as well. And this is something we'll want to get into in the next little bit here. How are we doing for time? We're doing just fine. I like the clashes of the clock over there, and then I can tell where I'm at, right? Because then I don't have to wait for the students to suddenly get all restless and roughly and let me know that it's time to finish class, right? What was I going to say about these? This is just a little bit of comparison between the anaerobic and the aerobic system. I think I've mentioned most of these things already. The anaerobic system is basically glucose only, which means blood glucose and glycogen in the muscles. A very small amount maybe from amino acids getting converted into glucose, again, depending on what's in your blood at that current moment, right? And all those kind of things. You can get a good amount of energy from the anaerobic lactic acid system. It's not quite as abundant as what you would get using oxygen, where you're bringing and oxidizing the glucose down right to carbon dioxide. But it's good, right? You can do it. Most of us can do something strenuous for a short amount of time, whether it's 1 minute or 2 minutes. Most of us are capable of that kind of thing. Your performance may be different based on training and those kind of things, but most of us are capable of doing something strenuous for at least a minute. What was the other thing I was going to say? We talked about lactic acid, fuels, those kind of things. And you can see the other thing about the aerobic system, which I kind of alluded to, right, is it's kind of a slow and steady system. And it does speed up with exercise and training. And that's ultimately what people are trying to do when they're training for certain sports and those kind of things, is to find, and so that's why you do a warm-up too, generally, right? And maybe you're doing warming up for a run or a swim or something like that, or whatever it might be, a soccer game. You're doing that warm up to kind of get that stretching in and getting the blood flowing to the muscles and those kind of things. It's going to help you get that aerobic system going and kick-started a little bit quicker. And then you can tap into those energy reserves. All right, what else do we have here? This is just showing, some details in terms of the food and what's going on, right? So you can see there's that first part, right? We want glucose. Glucose you can get from food. That's going to go in your blood. You also have glucose from your glycogen reserves in your muscles. Okay, and there's the anaerobic system. It's breaking it down just partially and getting a little bit of energy, but it's quick. And there's the aerobic system there, getting much more energy. Just takes a little bit of time to get going. So I guess we settled out already. Okay, so glycogen. Just looking here to see what I haven't said already. I've told you a little bit about kind of that 2-hour mark for glycogen for activities, and not quite 2,000 calories. Again, depending on your fitness and your muscle mass and your training, you can have more or less glycogen, but kind of that 2,000 number, I've seen it in a number of different places anyway. And what else is going to say? I feel like there's something I'm missing about glycogen. Oh, something we're going to talk about here and get into is, when you're exercising and you're using up that glucose, right? And particularly for people who want performance, right? We want glucose. And so sometimes that means actually eating stuff or consuming stuff during an event. And a good example is like a marathon, right? So marathon, let's say it takes you 6 hours to do it. You've used up all your glycogen within 2 hours. So this is a good event to actually be consuming things like sports drinks that have sugar in them and very easily digestible carbohydrates. So remember all those high glycemic things that we don't want to have if we're diabetic? You want them when you're running a marathon, right? So, white bread, I don't know who eats white bread while they're running a marathon, but I saw on TV somebody they had a bag of pretzels, right? So that makes sense. Very easy to digest, has salt in it, so replacing electrolytes, those kind of things. But yeah, the sports drinks is going to go down really quickly, very easy to consume. You can keep on running. You don't have to worry about chewing. But anyway, like I said, there's lots of recipes and formulas and ideas for that. And you can see this thing about replacing glycogen as well after exercise can be important for some athletes as well, particularly if you're trying to increase your muscles' glycogen reserves. So if you're looking at performing well, what do we need? We need glucose. Preferably complex carbohydrates that the body can consume at the right rate. But immediately before an event, right? A lot of people eat a pregame something or another, and that's where the high glycemic things are not a bad thing, right? And so you might see these, lots of people have these energy bars and things like that. Not really necessarily a bad thing, 5 minutes before a soccer game or something like that, it's getting you some glucose into your blood right away. It's going to provide energy for you. Those kind of things. Lots of studies done on this. This is actually data based off a pretty famous study that was done a number of years ago, kind of looking at, I can't remember, I think it was runners, and in terms of the diet and the kind of endurance time, and you can see it really is carbohydrate based. Carbohydrates being kind of the energy of choice that your body really wants. So something that if you are an athlete or you've done this kind of thing, you may have heard of is something called carbohydrate loading. So some elite athletes, they do these kind of things to try to, this is sort of a plan leading up to, about a week before an event. What they want to do is get their muscles to have extra glycogen so they have extra energy for whatever it is that they're doing, right? So the idea is, and there's different schemes around it and different opinions on exactly how to do this, but the idea is that, leading up to that week before your event is you reduce your training, right? You don't want to be exhausted, do exhaustive training the day before the event and be too tired of the day of the event. So part of that makes sense, but it also is for your muscles as well and gives them a chance to increase their glycogen stores. And the other part of it is obviously eating carbohydrates a decent amount leading up into that event. I'll show you, I think I have a little chart here that kind of shows a plan. I thought I had a plan, there's the plan. Like I said, there's different opinions on how to do this, and I'll show you another chart here in a moment. But you see the idea there. So 6 days before the event, you're maybe reducing a level to more of a moderate level, training 90 minutes, eating a normal meal, and then as you get closer and closer to the event, the training kind of tapers off, right? And then you're starting to get a bunch of spaghetti meals and like things like that in there, where you're getting a lot of carbohydrates to increase your muscle glycogen. And there's a number of studies that shows it does work. The question is, what is the best scheme? That's where it kind of gets interesting. Question?
We did tapering a lot for like really big meets when I used to swim, and I
Sure.
found it helped a lot.
Yeah, I know.
It was
Yeah.
insane.
Yeah, no, I remember doing it as well. Yeah, and yeah, I mean, there's definitely lots of research to show that it works. Like I said, the arguments are exactly how to do this, right? This is just, I want to show for the graphs. You can see this is showing the glycogen, amount of glycogen in the muscles and how it is getting increased here, right? And so this is something really important for if you're trying to do a marathon or something like that as well, where you're hoping, maybe I can squeeze 2 hours out as opposed to 90 minutes of glycogen, right? And this is something for people doing endurance events. They talk about hitting the wall. I don't know if anyone's ever heard that. You're doing the marathon, you're running, and then your glycogen just suddenly gets depleted and it just feels like you're gonna die because your energy levels just tank. And so again, training to try to get past that, and training to try to extend that hitting the wall event. I found this on the internet. Like I said, there's tons of schemes on how to do this. And this person is arguing if you do the classical way, you're going to increase your glycogen storage only so much. But if you do it my way, it's going to be much better. And you see all these kind of things on the internet. And those are all, like I said, that's where the arguments are. Exactly how to do it is sometimes where it gets to being kind of interesting. And every time the Olympics come around, there's always some athlete that's talking about trying a new scheme, and it's kind of interesting stuff. But the basics are tapering off, carbohydrate loading, and getting that better endurance for sure. So what are good carbohydrate loading foods? All the carbohydrate foods, and again, depending on how soon before your event, simple sugars are not necessarily a bad thing to help you get some glucose into your blood and whatnot. But kind of looking at all these high glycemic things are all good. Again, if you're eating days before, it's more recommended you're going for complex carbohydrates because then your body has a chance to absorb them a certain amount. Another thing I was going to say is generally when you're doing the training, it's good to get those carbohydrates in the system kind of relatively soon after the training. Because if you think about it, you just did some training. Let's say you've done 90 minutes of intense training. You've used up, in that case, maybe most of your glycogen stores. So now what is your body going to do? It's going to look for glycogen, or it's going to look for glucose to replace the glycogen stores. And if you don't have any in your body immediately, it's going to look for other options, which means breaking down protein, right? And then that protein may not necessarily be used for the muscles, or if it's body protein. So the idea is after intense training, you do consume carbohydrates as immediately as possible in order to help your muscles recover. And I think I've got another couple of comments on that a little bit later here as well. Just looking to see if I touched on all these kind of things. I think we did a little bit here and there. So it says activity duration affects glucose use as well intensity. Those kind of things are all important. Feel like I'm just retreading here on a few things. Let's keep going on after that. I already said this, glucose after activity is a good idea, right? Okay, yeah. What are some good foods? All the high glycemic things, rice, cornflakes apparently is a good one. I'm mentioning cornflakes because again, with athletic performance, protein is good to have in there too, right? Protein along with the carbohydrates. And generally when people eat cornflakes, they're eating with milk, which has protein in it as well, right? So always a good idea. Mashed potatoes, high glycemic food. Watermelon is good because it has electrolytes in it and carbohydrates, simple carbohydrates, and of course fluids, right? What about eating fat, right? So there are some people that argue that eating fat well or during or after exercise trains your body to burn fat better. This is one of these areas where there's mixed opinions on it, and the studies are showing different things. So it's kind of one of those things that basically the recommendation is always the recommendation. Yeah, have some fat in your diet, go for the unsaturated ones, et cetera, et cetera. It's probably not going to help with your performance, but it's good to have some fat in your diet. Even athletes who eat high amounts of saturated fats have higher risk for cardiovascular disease, which is, there's lots of studies on those kind of things, right? But anyway, maybe in the future we'll have better information on this. There are some plans I've seen that claim that they will do this, and I think they are research backed up and on all these kind of things. But generally, what's going to happen if you have a high-fat diet? You're going to have low energy because it's not readily accessible. Your body wants glucose to have energy, and the fat is more thought of as longer-term storage for energy. Protein consumption, I guess we talked about this a little bit already. Protein is important for building muscle, and it's important for a bunch of other things. The enzymes that are used to, let's say, break down fat, enzymes used to produce and consume glycogen, those are all proteins, et cetera, et cetera. And the amount of protein you are going to use is going to depend on your diet, your intensity, duration of training, all those kind of things and whatnot. And generally, the recommendation is that if you're trying to build mass, you do need a little protein, but the consuming of carbohydrate is good. So like I said, generally with your muscles, when you're training them, right, they're using glycogen, they want to replace it. And if carbohydrates are not available, then they're going to take it out of the protein that could be used to build that muscle and repair any damage or whatnot. So, I see this kind of thing happens all the time with youth sports. There's this obsession with protein. And I've mentioned the soccer moms, but they're not just the only ones to blame. Everyone seems to think, before the game, coach, I had 3 eggs for breakfast. And I'm just thinking, great, did you have anything else? Please tell me you had some carbohydrates. You're going to be running around for at least an hour here. And the answer is no, because I think the protein is what you need the focuses on, right? Carbohydrates for energy. Protein is going to be helpful, but it's more for muscle recovery and building than performance is like, it's not going to help you, right? So always that mix is very important. There's some recommendations. Again, it kind of depends on what you're doing and all those kind of things. I had told you, maybe a gram per for body height, a centimeter is one of the recommendations for people looking to build muscle mass. This is a little bit lower. This is more for general athletics rather than bodybuilding. But like I said, there's tons of charts like these, and the numbers are always kind of like really just what that general daily recommended value is, and then add a little bit. Most of us are already in that category. Sometimes it's around eating. The recommendations might be around eating, a little bit, having a little bit before or during or after, and those kind of things. And it kind of depends on what the intended activity is, right? But generally after is going to be a little bit more helpful for athletics, because that's when your muscles are looking to repair themselves or build or those kind of things. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about iron. There's a few things to be said about iron. Athletes need more iron. Exercising needs more iron because your muscles are using iron because of all that myoglobin and hemoglobin is kind of the main thing going on, right? That's what's making things red, muscles and blood, right? So if you're using more blood, you're going to recycle through your blood quicker. You're going to need a little bit more iron. Something that happens to some people when they start training, some people take up jogging, or they say, I'm going to train for a marathon. They've never done it before. Is some people become, I'm trying to remember the term, it's like athletic anemic or something like that. It's kind of a fact that happens sometimes early on in a training regime when someone hasn't been doing any training. Because what happens is your body, it says, oh, okay, we've exercised. It's been a while. And okay, time to make some new red blood cells. And what it actually does is it cleans out all the old bad ones. not as quickly as it makes some new ones. So some people become temporarily anemic from suddenly doing endurance exercise. So you may hear about that. It's not usually a huge concern. It usually rectifies itself after a few days, kind of thing. But there's two categories of athletes that are the biggest ones that are most likely to be iron deficient. One is vegan athletes, depending on their diet. Some of them are kind of in that zone of getting just enough iron, but then with the athletics, it sort of pushes it to the point where they really do need a little bit more. And as we talked about with iron, iron is absorbed more readily by the body when it is attached to heme, and that usually means some sort of animal product. And if they're vegan, they're not getting that in, so they have to make sure they're, if they have a balanced diet, not a problem. But that's kind of the thing, just to make sure they're getting a little bit extra. There's all sorts of supplements. And again, the biggest concern is that you're not absorbing as efficiently from the supplements as you are from foods. The other category is women. Sometimes female athletes need extra iron generally due to menstruation, and sometimes female athletes find themselves being anemic as well, a little bit from just the extra iron usage. And I think I was saying before, the number one kind of when you're a little bit iron deficient, you're tired. And there's a lot of college, university students that kind of get into that zone. And some of them are athletes as well, which kind of puts them to riskier because suddenly you're cooking or buying your own food for the first time, and meat is expensive. And so that's kind of a common kind of story of where they go to their doctor, and the doctor sometimes doesn't even test them or test them and finds out they're just kind of maybe not anemic, but kind of in that zone of being almost there, right? And anyway, the other thing, reminder, is vitamin C rich foods help you absorb iron. So, all right, we talked a little bit about fluids already. So just some reminders around that category. When people are exercising, they are using more fluids. You probably know that you sweat, and sweat is basically your body's way to try to cool itself down. And the more vigorous or the hotter the temperature, you can lose a lot of fluids in some cases. And so it's important that people do hydrate. And there's lots of conversations around hydration. And I think I gave you a number that your body can lose up to 2 liters in some extreme circumstances per hour. The other number I didn't give you is your body can only absorb about 1 liter of liquid an hour. So, that's one of those things in terms of, people looking at events, and there's I'll show you a scheme here that talks about, how much you should drink before exercising and those kind of things. And there, lots of people like to argue about it and trying to get people all super hydrated. And since then, I actually read one study that says in extreme circumstances, you could lose up to 3 liters an hour. And I didn't look at the details on that one, but we'll stick with 2 for now. That's still a lot of liquid. So one of the other things, if you're a coach or a parent or something, people obviously worry about things like heat stroke. And that's when people are not able to cool their body down to an adequate degree. I think I've got a little slide here that shows some of the symptoms of heat stroke or heat exhaustion, right? Generally, the first symptom of heat exhaustion or heat stroke is just that exhaustion, right? Suddenly you just feel tired. And that's actually your body saying, okay, stop doing what's doing. Go cool off, get a drink of water. Thirst is usually in there somewhere. You can see some more extreme kind of, so you can see the heat exhaustion is kind of the more mild version of heat stroke is really what it is, right? So heat exhaustion, kind of the, you're tired. Sometimes people sweat excessively. That's the body just trying to cool itself down. Okay, I'm too hot. Let's just make more sweat. Those kind of things, clammy, crampy, those kind of things. Heat stroke is considered a little bit more serious. You're talking about, confusion, some mental things, headaches, things like that going on, the brain dizziness and whatnot. Sometimes people stop sweating. I don't really know how that works, what's going on in the body. Heat stroke can be fatal in some circumstances, so it can be very dangerous, right? So knowing kind of the signs of heat exhaustion is good to prevent the heat stroke, right? And those kind of things. You may have noticed, why is this not, come on, there we go. Do this manually. You may have noticed hypothermia is on here. Hypothermia is kind of the opposite, right? Hypo means not enough, thermia is heat, so it means you don't have enough heat in your body. That's when you get too cool. Not going to go into that a whole bunch, but it does happen sometimes to athletes. Particularly the biggest group is inexperienced runners who don't know exactly what to do about the cold weather, and they still want to go for an hour, right? And it's a big concern. I had a high school teacher that would go for 2 hours jogs all year long, right? And he was talking about that one day, and he was saying, and I always tell my wife where I'm going, because like, think about it. I warm up, and then I go out and I just have a light track jacket on. It's -20 below, and what if I like twist my ankle or something like that, or fall in the ditch, right? And this is before cell phones, so you had no way to check in. But it's a concern, right? Imagine that you twist your ankle, your body is cooling down, and you get hypothermia, right? Okay, fluids. So we talked about this already. What's the best fluid for drinking is usually water. The body is very good at absorbing water. There's different recommendations around the temperatures of water in terms of what you can absorb. The water can absorb relatively cool water a little quicker than warm water. But again, if you're jogging in the winter or something like that, the recommendation is actually the opposite, that you're drinking room temperature water because you don't want to make the body, the internal core, cooler and those kind of things. We talked a little bit about sports drinks, of course. Here's the chart I was telling you about. There's some recommendations about how much to drink before and during and after and those kind of things, right? And again, there's so much preference going on here, and I'm a big believer in listening to your body. Some people will tell you that when you're thirsty, it's already too late. I don't know if anyone's ever heard that kind of thing. When you're thirsty, it does mean that your body needs fluids. It doesn't mean it's too late and you're going to die or anything like that. But excessive thirst, yeah, maybe at that point it's too late. So listen to your body. A little thirsty is good. If you're anticipating it being hot and you're going to sweat a lot, having drinks before the activity is a pretty good idea for sure. We talked a little bit about electrolytes and sports drinks already. There's a term for that. I can't remember if I gave you before. It's hyponatremia. So hypo means not enough. Na is sodium, right? It's the chemical symbol for sodium, and remia means blood, right? So anytime you see something to do with tremia, it has something to do with blood, right? So this means not enough sodium in your blood. But sometimes it's extended to mean not enough other electrolytes as well. And this can be a concern. There's some symptoms here. Sometimes what happens if you don't have enough sodium in your blood, your liquids in your cells and all those kind of things get unbalanced, and people will actually bloat, particularly around feet and ankles and things like that, apparently. But kind of in some ways looks a little bit like heat stroke, right? Confusion, seizures are possible, those kind of things. And sometimes goes hand in hand with heat stroke because the person hasn't been consuming fluids or something like that in a while, right? What about sports drinks? We talked about sports drinks. Just kind of an update on this kind of thing. What's the big deal about sports drinks? Well, they've got electrolytes, they've got fluids, and they've, some of them, if you're having one with sugar, has the carbohydrates. I told you the 90 minutes bar. Again, this is something that people disagree on. I've heard 2 hours, 1 hour. We can go with 1 hour if you want. But generally, if you're doing something less than an hour, you don't need the sports drink, right? If you have 2 hours of glycogen, you're probably good. Most of us are probably good for at least an hour of glycogen. If you're really athletic, you're probably good for at least 2 hours and that kind of thing. So sports drinks, yeah, I mean, particularly if you're doing marathons or something like that, they're definitely going to help you, particularly after you've hit the wall and you have no more glucose in your body to use, right? So these are not a bad thing. I meant to put this slide in. I don't have this slide in your slides. I added it in this morning, snuck it in there. Meant to talk about this one earlier though, right? In terms of post-workout. There's all sorts of post-workout products out there nowadays. Probably none of them are ever going to beat chocolate milk. Partly just because chocolate milk tastes way better than all the other ones. But chocolate milk actually has electrolytes in there, has a really good balance of protein and carbohydrates. You can see there's a nutrition label there. Some of the athletic sites tell you that milk has more protein than eggs. It does not. An egg, I looked it up just to be sure. An egg has about maybe 12 to 13 grams of protein. This is like what, 8 or 10 or something like that. Okay, 7. One of the other nutrition labels I was looking at said 8. But that's not bad. That's actually a pretty decent amount of protein in there. And you're starting to see this get really promoted. This was never promoted when I was a kid, and I'm really disappointed, right? You know, if there's any one thing I could have had more in my childhood, it was chocolate milk, definitely. But you're seeing this all over the place. I saw whatever, Swim Canada had a big article on it, promoting it for swimmers. And you know, many swimmers, if you're a swimmer, you know, practice can be 2 hours, right? So there goes your glycogen, boom, all gone. And many sports are like that, right? Practice is 2 hours very easily. Okay, probably out of time here. Let me just see what this next slide is here. So maybe I'll finish off in this slide and just say a couple of things, and we'll finish everything off next day. So obviously carbohydrates and protein are important for athletics, but what about all the other stuff? Some people seem to think if they take vitamins right before an event or working out is going to help, and the answer is no. It takes time for your body to absorb vitamins and most nutrients. Not to say that they're not important, right? All of these things are important for body growth and development and building muscle and building other tissues and those kind of things. So having that good balanced diet is going to help overall, which is kind of the theme of the whole course, of course, right? But just want to mention that just about vitamins, because I've seen people push that kind of thing as taking them right before an event, and it's pretty much pointless. You can see this is the recommendation for athletes or for performing, which is maybe a little bit more higher on the carbohydrates. Again, it kind of depends on what kind of athlete you are. You can see that number is about 60% of your diet being carbohydrates. Extreme athletes, you know, you're looking at them trying to push that up to 70, 75% and whatnot. Just want to peek at the next slide. No, not that one there. I was going to talk a little bit about Michael Phelps, the swimmer. We'll talk about that next day, but he was training for Beijing, 10,000 calories a day.
Oh my God.
I know. Don't try that at home, kids. Okay, but I'll finish there. We'll finish this next day. We'll see everybody on Friday.